Welcome to the Rimworld mod rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Vanilla Furniture Expanded Factory. For starters, you'll need the additional workshop content, Vanilla Expanded Framework, and Harmony. Today we're automating. From farming to firearms, chances are if you can put the raw materials for it on a belt, you can have it automatically manufactured for you. Now, I'll be covering this mod as if you own all of the official DLC and some other Vanilla Expanded bits. If you're missing any of the DLC, or if you don't use any of the other mods mentioned, some of these parts might be missing for you. We'll be going through these buildings in terms of their purpose rather than project by project, as there's only 2 projects. I'll make sure to keep the project that grants the structure we're discussing in the top right corner of the video, and I'll flag if it needs a specific DLC or mod as well. And yes, I am going to be recording this video on my 1.6 mod pack too. So if you see anything in this rundown that you do like the look of that doesn't seem to be related to the factories, check out the description for the updated workshop link to my mod pack. Now, first thing to mention up front is that factories are going to be expensive to build. You'll need a pretty hefty stockpile of components and steel as a bare minimum to get started. So you're probably going to want the ground penetrating scanner and deep drills unlocked as a bare minimum to get you started. Not only that, whilst running, some of these factories are going to be absolutely rinsing through your available power surplus, so make sure you've unlocked geothermals, batteries, and got any additional generators you need ready for the pressure that these setups are going to place on your colony. That way you'll have an easier time getting the ball rolling when building a simple factory setup, which will eventually gather the resources for you to build out something more complex and sprawling. Let's dig in anyway, with the most fundamental part of any factory, the required unique floor. Every single tile of factory flooring is going to cost you 5 steel, which is why you're going to want a solid stockpile before you get started, as this cost can quickly burn through entire stacks of steel. Pretty much all of your factory buildings are going to need this flooring underneath them to be placed. There are a few exceptions, and I'll be sure to mention those when they do come up. You'll also find that this factory flooring is ugly, it's dirty, and it's slow to traverse. I'm also not sure how alone I am in this, but the density of the hazard lines plays havoc with my eyes, so the sooner I can cover up this magic eye picture texture, the better. Floors are done. Let's cover the structures that will allow your factory to function or thrive. Hoppers, conveyors, heat sinks, and boosters. Hoppers are first. If you've ever used a nutrient paste dispenser, you already know how these work. You just need to get used to the specific positioning for factories rather than the omni-insertion method of paste. These won't require factory flooring beneath them, and they cost just 20 steel each. Hoppers will update their graphic depending on where they're placed, either as neutral, input, or output designations. Colonists can manually feed hoppers if it's needed, but you can also automate delivery of resources to them using the next structure that we're going to cover, conveyor belts. As well as the usual allowed resources panel for these hoppers, the same thing you get on shelves or stockpiles, you can also disallow manual depositing and manual taking of items from them if you want to keep your factory health and safety compliant and avoid colonists digging bare hands into what is essentially an enormous crush risk. Also, take note of the side of the hopper that has the little extra sliver of metal. I take that to be the feed direction. I try and make sure that that part is the bit connecting to the factory or belt as required. Conveyor belts then. A whole lot going on here, but Factorio players will be immediately at home. Belts aren't going to require factory flooring beneath them, so you can build all kinds of long looping setups if you want. They also include mergers, splitters, filters, refueling ports, and underground conveyor belts too. It's quite a lot to cover for just a humble belt. Let's go with the cost first and foremost. Each tile is going to take 10 steel, and they're pretty rapid to throw down, a little bit faster than it'd take to place a piece of carpet. Some more basic questions that you might have around them. No, colonists can't use them like an airport travelator, so you can't railgun your colonists to the front line by having them dash over a line of conveyor belts. Items can't be grabbed from the belt. even if it's currently not moving for whatever reason. Items need to either fall off the end of a belt or land in a hopper before they can be handled or used by a colonist or a factory. Straight belts are simple. Intersecting belts is where you're going to be given the option for mergers, splitters, and filters. Depending on the direction of how you first build a belt into a junction is going to be what determines if it becomes a splitter or a merger. You don't need to overthink balancing your belts too much here. Splitters will just evenly distribute across the output, and mergers will inhale whatever you throw at it. To make a filter, you first need to create a splitter, and then use the filter option, like you would with a stockpile, to determine what resources you want to travel directly along the belt, and anything that isn't allowed in the filter will instead be spat out to the side, allowing you to create a single, massively over-engineered and complicated mixed belt for feeding your entire factory, that leads to individual machines via a series of yes-no filters. Refueling ports are something that will be automatically added to a normal belt if it ends on a structure like a fuel generator or a pod launcher. Just be aware that if you're using something alongside factories, like chem fuel expanded, you'll still need to belt chem fuel into a drain. It won't be able to go directly into a storage tank. Finally, you have underground conveyors. If you use these to their fullest extent and aim to hit the furthest range possible each time, you can save a little bit of your steel overall on belt building, but you're going to have to pay for it with components. The difference is 90 steel of basic belts compared to 40 steel and 2 components, which in raw steel terms is 64. It's a small saving overall, but these component costs do add up early game. These underground belts also allow you to make a setup that doesn't completely box in your colonists or prevent them from walking around your factory once it gets a little bit more involved. The only issue is that underground belts can only go in a single direction. You'll still need some belts above ground to make any turns. Now, that was a hell of a lot of yapping about conveyors, so let's move on to heat sinks. You may notice over time that your factory gets hot, really hot. All of these automated buildings are going to kick out a significant amount of heat that can be mitigated by placing heat sinks, with each factory building supporting up to 4. A single heatsink is capable of connecting to multiple factories, with its limitation being based around its interaction range, so it's not going to be able to connect over vast distances, meaning if you want to make good use of them, you want them right in the middle of the setup. Each heatsink reduces the heat output from a factory by 25%, so a full accompaniment of heatsinks is going to completely negate the heat generation of a large factory operation. Don't underestimate the importance of these heatsinks either. Big factories can, and will, reach such a high temperature that they will periodically break down and potentially start fires. If you want to get the most out of these heatsinks, you can also add in a factory booster on your structures too. These play heavily into the overclocking mechanic included with the mod. That's going to drastically increase the heat generation and power consumption of a structure for a comparatively small boost to work speed. We'll go over that in a second. Up to 3 boosters can be connected per factory, with each one allowing an additional 100% of overclocking potential. So given that we know overclocking is going to cap at 500% when a factory is connected to 3 boosters, as they can hit 200% by default, how does the scaling of overclocking actually work? Those who've played Satisfactory already know there are, broadly speaking, certain buildings that will benefit from overclocking far more than simply trying to overclock everything, because the output and consumption percentages are not linear. The same is true in Rimworld. Your gathering buildings may see a reasonable return. Crafting and refining, perhaps not so much. Using an automated machining bay is the example here, because it has a nice round 500 watts of power consumption. We can see that a 200% overclock increases the power need to 1625 watts. That's a 325% power demand against the 200% output it's providing. This graph style becomes even more apparent if you go up to the max of a 500% overclock. with the power need then reaching 9,500 watts. That's a 1,900% increase on the power for a 500% increase on the output. If you have the option, building a second factory is always going to be more efficient than overclocking one you already have. On the off chance you don't have the spare materials to build that second factory yet, if for example you were lacking advanced components, overclocking could be useful as a short-term solution to speed up that acquisition process to get the materials to build the second factory. Then you can remove the overclock and return to normal consumption rates. It isn't just that power consumption either that you should be considering, as the heat generation is also rising by that same percentage. So if you didn't have a full set of heat sinks around to totally negate it, don't be that surprised when your 500% overclocked factory almost immediately turns into an air fryer. Alright, that's the very basics of your factory. Now we'll break down the actual structures you get by putting them into categories: gathering, refining, crafting, and disposal. There is a little bit of overlap here, as some refining buildings may also craft. Equally, some crafting buildings might have refinement options, but I've placed them where they fit best for what I consider to be their primary purpose. Getting started on gathering, we have the Auto Farmer. This agricultural monster works like a farmland Waymo, being remotely controlled by a driver in the Philippines who's paid the equivalent of a ham sandwich for a day's work. The Auto Farmer does have a huge power draw whilst active, needing 1,200 watts, but it's going to spend most of its life chilling on the platform waiting for the crops to grow to maturity, during which it'll only need to sip 50 watts of power. This means it lends itself into drawing its power from a battery bank, rather than building its consumption into the constant float of your power grid. You'll see the zone potential when placing this structure, and notice it's one of the few buildings that doesn't require a factory floor beneath it, as it creates its own bay when placed. If you want to connect these things up to hoppers, they need to be placed behind the farmer, and without hoppers it simply leaves any harvested crops in the field. It comes with a 7-tile wide reach, going from 3 tiles in length at its shortest to 30 at its longest. The length of that zone is entirely in your control, so if you find that you're flooding your stockpile with a huge excess of rice, you can simply knock back the designation a little bit and avoid having quite so many plants automated. As well as that, you also have the option on allowing it to auto-harvest, auto-sow, or automate the entire cycle when the current crops are fully grown. You're going to need to manually press the button to start this the first time, even when it's fully automated, just to give it a nudge in the right direction. Just be aware that this can only plant the most basic crops. It's not handling something like Devil Strand or trees, or anything you've got that requires a planting skill if you're using a lot of modded content. The automated drill platform is another building that doesn't need factory flooring, as chances are you'll be building this outside of your factory and it's going to be excavating the ground directly beneath it. Drills have a few processing options here. It's able to dig for simple rock chunks, which are going to match those available on your current tile. So if you don't have access to marble or granite, for example, you still won't be able to gather it by using this. It can also dig for random metals, finding everything you'd expect: steel, plasteel, uranium, silver, jade, and gold. Due to this, you don't usually want these spitting out their produce onto a belt that leads directly to a factory hopper, as it may clog up the belt with things like uranium that aren't being requested. As such, make sure you do have filtered splitters in place if you do want to belt directly from a drill to a factory, to keep your belts clear of obstructions. For the majority of your factory building endeavours, your drill platforms will be the backbone of the setup, keeping you topped up with raw materials to add more structures, as well as feeding your crafting structures and refineries. If you're using Odyssey, you're going to have the option of building a fish farm. As you'd expect, you ain't building this on factory flooring, because the catch rate would be atrocious. You'll need access to a 3x3 footprint for the farm itself over water, and its output needs to land on a ground tile, something you could build a hopper on. Fish farms can't be overclocked because they work by breeding fish within the water that they're placed on. As such, the type of water and biome you're living in is going to determine what fish you can create with this structure. The fish farm will need a little bit of time to wind up before it starts actually harvesting fish, with it producing 3 0.25 nutrition fish every 12 hours. That works out to 3 simple meals per farm per day. Honestly, not that bad for 350 watts of power consumption and a source of food that is more reliable than crops the majority of the time, not accounting for gill rot. Whilst that negative event is in progress, your fish farms will stop working and wait for the disease to clear. Now we move up to refining options, so we'll be dealing with things that have input requirements now. You should be nice and familiar with how the outputs work from the 3 previous structures, because I've shown them multiple times. If this video has been on your second monitor and you haven't even glanced at it during this, it's on you if you can't figure out how to set this shit up at this point. One quick thing to mention is that going forwards, all of these structures will suffer a 50% work speed penalty if you place them outside of a building classified as a factory. So you don't want to mix your factory into an existing workshop, and you definitely don't want to place these outside. Just like with normal crafting builds, you also have the option of setting things to do X times, do until X, or do forever. So depending on the type of builds that you're setting up, you could have a factory making one thing all day every day, such as beer from a distillery. But you might also want to set your auto loom to make a spare set of clothing, so individual builds for pants, shirt and a duster. That way you've always got the most basic loadout ready for any new joiner at all times. Let's start by going over the smelter. You're already going to be familiar with its processes as they're the same as a base game smelter. Only now it doesn't need manual input from a colonist to work. This will let you break down all kinds of things into their base materials. Slag, weapons, apparel, mechanoids, all of them can be fed and turned back into a simple metal. You also have the option here to feed it stone chunks, which will return a very small amount of steel. For the sake of argument, even though I don't believe it to be the best course of action, you could use your drill to mine for chunks rather than going for random metals, which can then be reliably turned into steel via the smelter. However, even a single tick of steel from the drill is going to provide 45 steel, so going the route of chunks is making the assumption that your drill will fail to provide steel 15 times in a row. Basically, it's unlikely to ever be more efficient than just digging for random metal. It is a very nice way to clear up any spare chunks on your map though, if you've already got a boatload of stone blocks ready. On the topic of blocks, now we've got the masonry saw. Easily the most straightforward refinery option. This is going to turn chunks into blocks, exactly the same as a stone cutting table. It's one of the cheapest things to keep running in terms of power consumption, needing only 150 watts, so if you aren't super confident on building a factory and setting up automated lines, I'd suggest starting with a simple drill, place down some hoppers, belts and a masonry saw. It's nice and affordable to place down, so if you do make a mistake, it's not going to cost you a bunch of resources to deconstruct it and try again. From blocks to biofuel. The automated biofuel refinery is going to make chem fuel from either wood or organics, like the manual refinery. Helpful if you've got a surplus of food or raw ingredients that are blocking up your belts, allowing you to turn that excess into fuel that can then feed generators that keep your factory running. Nothing particularly groundbreaking here, and chances are if you're using something like Chem Fuel Expanded, you've already got alternative methods of acquiring fuel that are less resource intensive, such as a deep chem refinery. Now we've got something that's going to be very useful if you're not using a mod like C# Meats, the automated mincer. This functions as a butcher's table that helps condense all of your different animal meats into a single homogeneous processed mince. It has exactly the same stats as normal animal meat, only it's easier to store, as if mince is all you're making, you only need to worry about a single stack type on your shelving. The mincer can also blend up human corpses and insectoids, turning them into human and insect meat respectively. Just be aware that even though it's the machine that's blending up humans, your colonists aren't exactly going to be thrilled about feeding bodies into this mangler, so mood debuffs still apply. On to something more advanced. the neutro synthesizer. This will allow you to turn chem fuel and meat into neutro, feeding very nicely off of the previously mentioned refinery and mincer. As you'd expect for something making a product that's so highly sought after and rare, it has quite a considerable amount of power consumption at 600 watts. However, a single one of these ticking away will easily provide your colony with a healthy supply of materials for all of your go juice, penioxycillin, wake up or industrial meds. Drug options that some players might normally skip due to the material cost of keeping them on hand. It's also fantastic if you've got a lot of hussars in your colony demanding their gym juice every 5 days, keeping them away from that deficiency state. One important feature to mention here is that if you're using VE Chem Fuel, the pipe networks from it can connect with any automated building that needs to make use of that material, so you don't necessarily need to belt the chem fuel over to the synthesizer. You could just hook it up to a storage tank and instead belt any chem fuel you are processing directly into a drain. That way, the building that demands chem fuel always has access to it without taking up one of its input slots. It's going to be especially useful for factories that have more resource requirements than potential inputs. Finally, at this refining stage, we have the alloy forge. This is going to be a building that's more dependent on the DLC and mods you have installed. As standard, this can combine steel, chem fuel and gold to make plasteel. So whilst your drill may occasionally grab a small amount of plasteel, this will allow you to feed other resources that it's collecting into the forge and make even more plasteel over time. With Odyssey, you'll also have options to make gravlite panels using vaxstone and plasteel, as well as obsidian by crushing stone chunks. Both of these resources are usually something that's quite limited, either via quest gating or spawning only in specific biomes. The reliable access to obsidian cannot be understated here. It's absolutely disgusting as a material for a melee weapon, making long swords that are capable of cleaving a target in half with a single good swing. Finally, if you're using the factions mod for classical, you're going to be able to combine steel and stone chunks to create bronze, which seems a little odd when you're making bronze when you have access to factory buildings that need a huge amount of components and demand this much power, but bronze is still quite useful for things like floor tiles and can make very pretty walls too. You're probably going to want a few alloy forges eventually, to avoid needing to constantly swap the processes and make sure that the input hoppers on this aren't being clogged up. Alright, that's the raw materials covered. Let's look into some crafting possibilities. Now we're getting into the slightly more tricky area of chaining structures together, as you could have a drill feeding into a forge that then leads to something from this group, like an ammunition press. I find when making large factory chains like this, it's easiest to build from the end and go back to the start. So place the final structure to begin with and then go backwards to the beginning. We've all made the mistake of writing a sentence and running out of space on the page towards the end of it, so your font gradually drops in size until you're basically writing sideways to fit the rest of it in. Given what we've mentioned here then, let's start with the ammunition press. This is going to handle all of your shell crafting needs. HE, incendiary, EMP, fire foam, smoke, and if you have biotech and anomaly, tox and dead life. Chances are you're not going to make everything at once that this factory can offer, so you won't need to sweat making sure that it has belts that can feed all potential ingredients into its 2 inputs, given that it may take steel, chem fuel components, or bioferrite. One nice thing about the whole mod seems to be that, even though the belts themselves are flammable, any items being transported by them appear to be immune, not just to damage but to weather effects as well. So if you're transporting HE shells via a belt to a more secure location, they actually pose very little risk, all whilst keeping your colonists well out of harm's way from having to fiddle with explosive materials. From the big bada boom to the parts you need to treat anyone who's been hit by it. The medicine granulator is an expensive bit of kit that will take over all of the jobs usually handled at your drug lab. So this is not just packing medkits, it's also rolling joints, grinding powders, packing pills and mixing juices. Oddly, most of the builds use the batch processing recipe, except for smoke leaf and penioxycillin. Those work in singles. Fortunately, the time it takes to craft does reflect this, so you aren't being screwed over. This is another one of those buildings that has a lot of potential resource choices, with very limited input spaces. It can potentially take 6 resources for all of its crafting builds, but only offers you 3 slots, which if you're making medicine is going to take all of them. Despite this being such a pricey machine, you will likely want a couple of them once your factory is up and running. One constantly handling medicine, and another to take care of your more exotic crafting. For some far more basic crafting, we have the conveyor oven. This won't have anywhere near as many options as your stove, so whilst it can still make pemmican, kibble, survival meals and baby food if you're using biotech, as well as uncooked simple soups with cooking expanded, the only fresh meal option here is going to be the mass-produced version, looking like a school dinner tray with its individual compartments and plastic cutlery. These mass-produced meals provide absolutely no mood bonus or penalty, so they are better than paste for most colonies, but the impact of a solid food buff shouldn't be understated. Interestingly, whereas the previously mentioned factories all required more potential resources than they had inputs for, the conveyor oven has 3 slots, but only ever needs raw meat or raw veggies, which can be very easily fulfilled by belting over mince from the corpse grinder and plants from an auto farmer. The third input would be useful if you're using a fish farm, as there might be a time that you run out of fresh corpses to turn into meat. As well as automating meals, you can also automate brewing at the distillery. You get a lot more from this building if you're using vanilla brewing expanded, as it can make all of the additional alcohol types that are included. By default, this will handle turning hops into beer, which saves you needing to make wort, and it keeps the product in a stable temperature to ferment, so you'll never have a ruined batch by using this. Given that the factory does only have a single input, it's unlikely that you're going to use one of these for multiple different brewing processes, especially as it still takes days to ferment before the product is ready. So if you're using brewing expanded and also want things like whiskey, tequila, vodka and gin, you may want a few additional distilleries so that each drink has its own still. These are also one of the few factories that could potentially be handled with manual loading, as it's handling such a small amount of the materials and taking a significant amount of time to produce. So if you had an auto farmer absolutely drowning one of these things in hops, it's just going to flood the belt and sit there for a quadrum. Let's cover the factory part that you will only have access to if you're using vanilla expanded cooking, the cannery. This can turn all kinds of raw food into canned goods that are not going to spoil, regardless of the temperature they're stored in. The basic ingredients this creates, such as meat, produce, fruit, eggs and fish, are all intended to be used as an ingredient at a later date. It allows you to carry a large amount of raw food safely across a vast distance if you're intending to relocate your base, or as a way of getting around building something like a refrigerator on board your grav ship. If you only wanted to stock tinned goods and make as many meals as the crew required, this would help avoid waste and spoiling via overstocking. The canned good that doesn't follow this trend, however, is soup, with 1 pot of uncooked soup, which can be made from your conveyor oven, turning into 10 tins of ready-to-eat deliciousness. Those restore as much nutrition as a standard meal. This is super cost efficient in terms of nutrition, with it making 10 portions of soup from the same amount of food it would take to produce 8 meals. However, every single process at the cannery needs a single unit of steel, so there is an extra material cost to consider here. Soup can be extremely useful in certain vegetation-starved biomes though, like a desert, when you really need to make those harvests stretch as far as possible. It'll also help having to fight the high temperatures too, because you can simply throw it on a shelf. You don't need to build a walk-in refrigerator. Back to something you're going to have regardless of what other mods you're running, the auto loom. Although its potential output is going to be dramatically impacted by what's normally available at your tailoring bench. This can make any item of clothing from whatever fabric or leather you feed into the machine, with the downside to the automation process being it's always going to be normal quality. useful to make very basic things like pants and shirts, or clothing items that are worn more for a stat offset than the actual protection they're offering, like a bandolier or a backpack perhaps. But it's unlikely to be something that you want to invest too heavily into when the quality modifiers can make such a huge difference in crafting with a more expensive or a rare material, like thrumbo fur. As well as being able to make clothing, this can also condense your leather scraps down into patch leather, if you wanted to use that to build certain furniture items. As well as that, it can fabricate synthread by combining cloth and chem fuel, items that are very accessible. While synthread isn't a top tier material by any means, it's accessible enough thanks to this auto loom that you can make those basic clothing items, previously mentioned, with a pretty solid stat line. It won't beat something like Devil Strand, but it doesn't take anywhere near as long to grow or harvest cotton, with cotton also being accessible from your auto farmer and chem fuel having numerous sources of availability too. Now we've got some of the biggest crafting factories. Let's start with the assembler. This is going to handle all of your components and advanced components, most likely becoming one of the most sought after structures in your entire setup. Whilst it isn't a fast process to make components and overclocking the machine will skyrocket its power consumption, it's going to form the backbone of everything you do once it's built, as it provides the parts necessary to further expand your factory and brings together all of those raw materials that you've been gathering from your drills. This will definitely have an assembly line that's going to take a little bit of time to get set up correctly and running smoothly, but it's near essential for a large scale factory or an entirely automated colony. Finally, for crafting we have the machining bay. This is taking everything from your machining table and automating the process for you. If you've been paying attention up till this point, you'll notice there's a couple of crafting benches that you're still going to have to handle manually, namely your smithy and any advanced armor or bionic crafting items that you would like from the fabrication table. So whilst this machining bay could handle something like creating all of your vac suits, chain shotguns, assault rifles or flak armor, for the very best equipment or any melee weapons, you're still going to need a good crafter in your colony to handle that. Of course, it's much easier to let your own crafters focus on the important tasks when every other job in the colony is being automated at a factory, and they're being constantly supplied with raw materials from your drills and assembler. That means we just have one more part to cover, the disposal option, which is an automated crematorium. It has the same bills as your standard burn box, but saves all of the manual labour and heat stroke risk by throwing things into the inferno via belt. Useful if you're in a colony that's extremely strict about things like drug use, as you can destroy any narcotics that raiders happen to bring with them, whilst also allowing you to easily dispose of any tainted clothing or clear your kill box after the latest purge of raiders. Chances are you're still going to have a colonist getting bummed out about having to haul numerous corpses into a hopper so that they can be fed into the crematorium, but at least you save them the grim reality of watching the skin melt from the bodies and the bones turn to ash. So there we have it, all your factory buildings allowing you to make your automated colony. Much better balanced than the iteration from mechanoids, as whilst the buildings and infrastructure to get a factory working are quite expensive, it's not so expensive that it's going to raise the raid threat level to an absurd number and make actually playing with a factory a death sentence. One thing you're not getting from this mod is a start that drops you into an abandoned factory, so you're always going to have to work towards it rather than using one from the get-go. Not that the research projects are exactly out of reach, it's a pretty quick hop to grab basic factories and get the resource collection efforts started without that much of a power demand and a pretty reasonable resource cost too. The hardest part you'll find is the demand on components before you have access to an assembler. Until that point, you're going to be spread pretty thin between making more power generators, taking care of your basic needs, and getting a factory set up. So if you want an easier time getting started with factories, consider landing on a tile that has good access to mountain formations. That way there should be a lot more compacted machinery spawns, so you won't be as reliant on passing traders that bring you goods every quadrum or so. All in all, absolutely solid mod. If you did watch my 1.6 core mod list video, this would comfortably land in the expanded section of case-by-case mods. It's quite a large amount of content to have loading all the time, if you're not making use of it, with basically zero overlap into another mechanic. So it's something I'd turn on or off depending on the run I'm going for. Apologies this video took a little while to get out too, not gonna lie, I've been very distracted watching the Race to World First on Twitch. Fortunately, you guys have got another 6 months or so before the next one, so I should be a bit more focused for a while. As always, if you'd like to see what I'm working on and get any insights into upcoming projects, it's all available to view on my Patreon page. All the posts there are free to read, but if you would like, you can support me in producing content for just £1 a month. It gets your name in the credits of these videos and it helps me to stay alive. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon or evening. Stay safe and take care.
Always watching over me, somehow you make me feel invisible. Power to my soul, yeah. I'm easy things that used to bother me, cause your existence just lights me up, yeah. You always got my back, and of course I got your back, don't you worry about that now.